This is such fun. I get to say hi to Casey Sherman after so many years. There's a lot of ground to cover with you. You were a news producer at News 8 many moons, right here, not at this table, but back there in the newsroom.
Right, exactly.
So many moons ago, and fast forward, you're a best-selling crime author. You've got a movie in the making. So let's start with the very beginning.
Okay.
So, news producer at News 8, then you go to Boston. Then you start to put pen to paper with your first book about your aunt, who was what?
Yeah, my Aunt Mary Sullivan was the last victim in the Boston Strangler case. And I had grown up in an Irish Catholic household on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and my mother always had questions about what had happened in her death. And that actually, those questions led me to journalism school at Boston University. I then went into broadcast journalism, and I was always fascinated by the Boston Strangler case, and particularly my family's connection to it. So,
because they never solved this
case.
No,
they never. It was very muddy, and they never had a definitive answer on who the killer was or killers were. So I began to take a fresh look at this case, and I started to research and interview a lot of the people that were
just
involved
on your
in the
own.
case.
You just went and said, you know what, I'm going to solve this case,
or
at least going to try.
Yeah, and it really was just to get answers from my mother. She was 17 when her 19-year-old sister was brutally murdered, and she never had that kind of closure. So she wanted answers, and as a son, I tried to provide those answers over time.
So walk me through how you did that, and then you finally get word not so long ago that yes, indeed, Mary, you believe, was the final victim of the Boston Strangler because of you.
Well, yeah, and I think because of a lot of other people, a lot of great people that worked this case and that never let Mary out of their thoughts. She was murdered on January 4th, 1964, a 19-year-old beautiful girl who had just moved to Boston 4 days before she was killed, and murdered in the most horrendous fashion. 3 ligatures wrapped tightly around her neck. She'd been assaulted sexually. As I started to take a fresh look at this case, I interviewed a lot of the people, a lot of the police officers, and a lot of the people that in the criminal element that were around at that time, and there were differing ideas and theories about who had done it. There was a man named Albert DeSalvo who confessed to the crimes, but he was never charged with them. He never went to prison for them. So as I said, it was open-ended, and the crimes were never officially solved. So I did a couple of things. I found the confession tape. This was the only thing that ever connected Albert DeSalvo to the murders, was the fact that he confessed to it. Not a shred of physical evidence ever tied him to the crimes, and that's curious because he was a very bungling crook. He'd had a criminal past. He'd been arrested for a lot of the different crimes that he had committed, and I put those that confession tape up against the autopsy reports and the murders, and they didn't match. DeSalvo was confessing to events that glaringly never happened. So I thought, geez, did he really do what he claimed he did? But I needed science to be the definitive answer. And about 10 years ago, we had to exhume my aunt's remains for DNA testing.
How painful for your family.
You know, and it was tough because we're an Irish Catholic family. My mother never wanted to make that decision, but we had gone to the authorities in Boston at the time asking for help. And we were rebuked in our request time and time again. And so I had reached out to some all-stars in the forensic community like Dr. Henry Lee, like Dr. Michael Bodden, et cetera. And I asked them, I said, is it possible to find trace evidence on a victim's remains 40 years after the crime? And they thought, it's possible. You have about a 5% chance you're going to find anything. And 5% was all we had. So I asked my mother, do you want this? And she said, Casey, Mary needs this. I really feel Mary needs closure, or at least Mary needs me to have closure. So we went through with the exhumation, and the test that we got back 10 years ago suggested that Albert DeSalvo was not the killer, that his DNA was not found on her remains. They thought they had found the killer's DNA on her remains, and that matched somebody else. That actually matched another suspect in this case. So we thought, case closed, or at least my mother had answers. And then fast forward literally to just a few months ago, where new technology and incredible advances in DNA testing had allowed them to go back and retest some of the physical samples that were found at the crime scene, and those samples did match Albert DeSalvo eventually.
So you finally got some closure there. You write a book, A Rose for Mary. That's in 2003. Now what starts to happen is you start to write about crime. 2007, Black Irish, 2008, Black Dragon, 2009, Bad Blood, on and on and on. Did you know this was in you to be a crime author?
No, not really, and I don't like to read crime novels. I'm really
well,
not
they're kind of
interested in it.
gory.
Yeah, they are. But to me, it's all about the story. You know, with A Rose for Mary, I was telling a family story.
Sure.
So there is crime in it, but you also you find a connection. How does a family seek justice on its own terms when everybody else does not allow them to? And that's the story that I told. I told a story about a bond between two sisters, and it's interesting, Ann. Women, especially women who belong to book clubs, they said they invite me to speak, and then they come up to me afterwards and they say, you know, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Sherman.
Yeah, exactly. I said, no, that's my dad, Casey. And they say, we weren't really interested in this book. It wasn't the genre that we like, but we read it. And I felt like I had lost my sister. And then I thought, what would I do if that happened to me? And that's exactly how I wanted to present this case to the people. I wanted them to really feel it in their hearts. And you know, the other books that I've written, you know, Bad Blood is an example. I was working as a TV producer in Boston, a TV news producer at the time, and there was a shooting, unfortunately, in Franconia, New Hampshire. And I remember the scanners in the newsroom coming down, officer down, that night. And of course, as the producer of the newscast,
It sends chills when you hear that.
sends chills. That's the last thing you want to hear. But you also have to react to it. And I remember it was such a far drive from Boston to Franconia Notch. We told the story with a map and a voiceover from our anchor person that night. And immediately that evening, that police shooting was sold to us, the media, as bad kid, hero cop, and good Samaritan saves the day. And the story in a nutshell is there's a young man who was actually the cousin of ski champion Bodie Miller. And he was a hippie kid. He had, you know, dyslexia, learning disabilities, but he was kind of a rebel in this one town. And he always butted heads with a tough cop from the town. The tough cop who was, you know, great to some people, but maybe had extended his bounds every once in a while, and they just continuously ran into each other. In the book, the title is called Bad Blood because one of the cops said, these guys had bad blood. Everybody knew that their conflict would explode in fiery violence one night, and it did. The police officer pulls over the kid one too many times and rams him off the road with his police car. It was all captured on dash cam video. The kid reacts by taking a gun and shooting the police officer 5 times. Shot at him 7 times, hits him 5 times. Now, that's an incredible explosion of violence, but you also have a third party involved. You have a good Samaritan, AKA a good Samaritan, an ex-Marine who stumbles upon the crime scene, gets out of his truck, picks up the dying officer's gun, and kills the kid with it. Now, right there, you have a TV movie of the week. That does not happen every day.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But when I went up to cover the police officer's funeral, and I was there just as an observer, somebody from town, it was a very emotional time for the entire town, the sea of blue, and people really honoring this fallen police officer. Somebody from town said, you're coming tomorrow, right? And I said, well, what's tomorrow? Well, tomorrow's the kid's funeral, because he was killed too. I said, why would I come to that? He said, you want to come to that. Next day, I took that drive. And everybody at the police officer's funeral was at the kid's funeral. So right there, I thought, there's something more here. And eventually, as I began to research and investigate that case, I found out that this was, was the cop a hero? Not really. Was the kid all bad? Not really. Was the good Samaritan who he claimed to be? Not at all. He's actually probably the villain in the entire episode.
Investigative reporter Casey Sherman. I have to ask you, for people who are watching this, and you're a New York Times bestseller, which is so awesome. When did you know you were going to put pen to paper and be an author and are loving it? And we're going to get to this
Sure.
next book here in a second. Give me, how did you know you were going to do this? And you just said to me, don't write a book to be a bestseller.
Right.
Write a book because you've got passion to tell a story.
Exactly. And when I was investigating my Aunt Mary's case, a lot of high-profile authors came to me and approached me and said, you're living a fascinating case. We want to write this book. And at first, Dan, I was very flattered by that. But then I thought, well, I'm a journalist, I'm living this, I need to write it, and it will succeed or fail based on those merits. And I remember sitting down and writing the book.
Did you type?
I typed.
How did you do it?
I actually, my first book I typed on a typewriter. And then I went to a word processor, and then I went to a computer. But I needed to feel it and touch it. And I had no idea on how to write a book. I went to journalism school, I was a journalist, but that taught me the who, what, where, when, and how. It never taught me how to build a narrative over time. But I am a voracious reader. I read everybody, so I really chose the techniques of my literary heroes, a la Hemingway, Steinbeck, Norman Mailer, etc., and I used their techniques to tell my own story, and eventually, thank God, I found my own voice.
Well, you certainly have. Let's get to the finest hours now about the Coast Guard. This book is amazing. People can't put it down. They'll just read through it. You also have a children's version coming out. This book is so good that Disney bought the rights to it. And let's go through the pictures.
Sure.
Here we see the finest hours. Tell me what we're seeing here.
Yeah, what we're seeing here is the stern section of a ship called the SS Pendleton. 500 feet long. It was literally split in half like a breadstick in a storm the size of the perfect storm.
A nor'easter.
A nor'easter off Cape Cod in 1952. Now that's one ship that broke apart. There's another ship also involved in the rescue that also broke apart 20 miles south of this, and you're looking at, actually, that's the bow section of the Pendleton, a very amazing dramatic image that is. And at the time, it was an unprecedented challenge for the Coast Guard because they had 84 men trapped on the bow and stern sections of each vessel. So they didn't have to launch 2 rescue attempts. They actually had to launch 4 because these sections were splitting in half at a rapid rate of speed. And we're talking 80-foot waves. Everybody has either read The Perfect Storm or seen the movie.
Sure.
Now imagine those wave heights, 80 to 100 feet. Now this storm was compounded by a blinding snowstorm. And that's what these men, these 4 men right here, are the heroes of the finest hours. They were given a suicide mission to take a 36-foot wooden lifeboat out into 80-foot seas with the simple order, save as many men as you can. That little boat right there is 36 feet long,
wow,
designed to only hold 12 people. They fit 36 men on that boat that night. And it's called the greatest small boat rescue in American history, and it's declared by the U.S. Coast Guard as their finest hour.
Now, somebody says, we want to make a movie out of this, and you say what?
Well, that actually, I said this should be a movie, and the studios said, get lost. And this is in 2009 when the book first came out. And remember, in 2009, the economy had turned, and as I was having these meetings with studio executives, to a person they said it's the wrong time for a movie like this because the economy has gone south. And I said, no, you're wrong. It's the perfect time for a movie like this because people need to be inspired.
So you're also a salesman.
Yes, I had to sell this because I'm very passionate about it, and I owed it to the men that performed that rescue to get this movie done. And the studios all said no in 2009. A couple of years later, Disney came and said, this is the movie we've been waiting to make. Don't negotiate with anybody else. We're going to make it.
And it's going to be made in the next year, you think, or shooting could start in the next year?
Yeah, shooting will start within this year, and then it'll be out in theaters either in summer of 2015 or Christmas 2015.
We're so proud of you. Now, so much to talk to you about. I want to get to Boston Strong. I want to get to the trip that you just returned from. Tell me about that trip.
It was an amazing trip. Myself and my co-author, we're writing a book called Boston Strong on the Boston Marathon tragedy. And our focus really is not necessarily on the bombers, but more focus on the survivors and their stories of resiliency.
And I do want to hear their stories.
Well, every story is amazing, and it just, you feel inspired by meeting them. And we were the only journalists allowed on a healing cruise that a company out of Boston called Vantage Deluxe World Travel literally spent $500,000 to take 100 survivors to France just to get away for 11 days because, they're bombarded with people wanting to do good things for them at home and constant reminders of what they'd gone through. But to get them in France was like putting them on a desert island, just to exhale and relax and to be with one another. And we observed some incredible support groups that were forming on this ship of survivors saying, I know you. You were at the bombing that I was at. Where is your injury? And so they're comparing injuries. They're comparing what their days are like. One survivor would say, I can't listen to a thunderstorm. I used to love to listen to thunderstorms, but loud noises scare me now.
What's the one thing that moved you when you were on this trip in France?
It was the relationship between one of the heroes and the father of one of the victims. One of the heroes, this gentleman named Carlos Arredondo, he became an iconic figure in this tragedy because he's the guy in the cowboy hat who's wheeling Jeff Bowman, legless Jeff Bowman, to safety and really saved his life. Carlos had lost two sons, one in the war in Iraq and another to suicide. And the other father was the father of the Chinese Boston University graduate student.
Sure.
And this gentleman couldn't speak English, but he came on the trip. And you could see originally that he didn't want to be there. He couldn't communicate with other passengers because, you know, the language barrier. He didn't have a common theme or background for these people. But with Carlos, who had lost his sons, and this man who had lost his daughter, they didn't have to talk. They had a communication in a language that was going between them, that was just two fathers dealing with grief and supporting each other, and it was really amazing to see.
And we get to read their stories, and Boston Strong comes out when?
It comes out in fall of 2014, but my co-author and I just penned an article about the trip in Esquire, so people can go to esquire.com and find the article. And it's 8 pages of real raw emotion, and it also tells the story that these survivors are dealing with this incident every day of their lives. It doesn't go away for them.
So proud to know you, and so proud to know what you are doing. Casey Sherman, once at News 8. We're going to follow your career, and all the best to you, and thank you for coming on.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much.